The day is barely awake. Along the Camden waterfront, the air tastes like river damp and hot metal that never truly cooled off overnight. Street lamps still burn in a thin morning fog, turning every puddle into a dull mirror. The factory squats ahead like a fortified city, brick, steel, soot, an industrial continent that has its own weather, its own gravity. And then you see them, not machines, people, men and women spilling toward the gates in work coats and caps, lunch pails in hand, moving the way a tide moves, automatic, practiced, resigned. The same walk they've done 1,000 times, the walk that keeps their rent paid and their kids fed, the walk that makes this whole place breathe. But today, the tide stops. A cluster forms at the entrance. A ripple passes through the crowd, not shouted, not announced, felt, like a nerve twitching in a body the size of a city block. Someone steps forward, a sign lifts into the air, another follows, then another. A few voices rise, careful at first, then louder, stacking into a single trembling idea. We're not going in. This isn't a slow day. This isn't a broken conveyor or a late shipment. This is a refusal, an emergency brake pulled by the hands that make everything in this place real. Inside those walls is power, radios, parts, circuits, symbols of a modern world that's arriving faster than anyone can process. But outside the walls is something older and more dangerous than any machine in the building, a workforce learning its own strength. By the end of the day, RCA will be issuing statements about this strike. Official words, corporate words, words meant to control the narrative before it catches fire. The record survives, archived and titled with cold precision. Statement on strike at RCA manufacturing plant in Camden, NJ, June 23, 1936. A title like that doesn't capture the sound. It doesn't capture the way a factory gate, something designed to swing open and swallow humans, suddenly becomes a line in the sand. Because what's happening here isn't just a labor dispute, it's the first crack in a monument. This strike, Camden, June 1936, will be remembered as one of the major labor battles of that summer, a breakthrough moment when electrical workers proved that even the biggest corporations could bleed. And in 1936, RCA was one of the biggest. A titan of the new American century, a name you could practically hear. RCA, 3 letters that promised music in your living room, news from across the world, a future delivered by wire and vacuum tube. A company that didn't just sell products, it sold wonder. Camden was one of its beating hearts. Right there, looming over the district like a company flag turned into architecture, stood the legendary Building 17, later nicknamed the Nipper Building, crowned with the His Master's Voice iconography that fused innocence with corporate dominance. A dog, head tilted, listening faithfully to a machine. It's hard to explain how perfect that image is, how accidental and how prophetic. A loyal creature listening for a voice that cannot love it back. Because this is the dark truth that hangs over the gates on this June morning. The factory doesn't care. The factory doesn't raise children. It doesn't mend bones. It doesn't sit up at night with a worker's spouse doing the math on bills. It doesn't attend funerals. It consumes labor the way a furnace consumes coal. Until someone finally says the word that the machine world can't tolerate. No. And if you're standing here at 6:12 a.m., watching workers turn a mammoth plant into a silent shell, by the simple act of refusing to enter, you can almost believe you're watching the beginning of the end. But the horror of industrial collapse is that it never feels like collapse at the start. It feels like weather. It feels like a bad week. It feels like management will compromise, like the gates will open tomorrow, like the machines will keep humming and Camden will keep feeding its families off the same promise it's always had, loyalty for security. And for a while, that promise works. For decades, it works. This place becomes more than a job site. It becomes a clock that sets the city's time, a heartbeat, a social contract written in paychecks and pensions, and the unspoken belief that if you give the company your life, the company will never abandon you. But that belief is where the story turns. Because the villain here isn't a single man with a cigar or a single bad decision or even a single era. The villain is hubris, the kind that infects giants, the kind that tells a company it can rewrite reality, ignore workers, ignore competition, ignore warning signs, ignore the slow corrosion of its own culture, because its name is carved too deeply into the American century to ever be erased. They say you can't kill a giant, but giants don't usually get murdered. They starve, they rot, they hollow out from the inside, one rational decision at a time, one cost-cutting spreadsheet at a time, one executive signature at a time, until the engineers and builders who once worshipped craft are replaced by people who worship extraction. And when that transformation completes, the giant doesn't even fall in a single dramatic moment. It simply leaves. By the early 1990s, the Camden plant complex would be vacated and abandoned by a successor company, with spaces left behind so empty that a historian later salvaged materials from an abandoned photo lab, like recovering bones from a collapsed civilization. That's how this story ends. Not with an explosion, but with abandonment. Not with a final product rolling off the line to applause, but with rooms left to darkness, floors stripped, windows shattered, and the city around it forced to keep living as its economic heart turns to ash. So when we start here, June 23, 1936, we're not just watching a strike. We're watching the moment the city within the city reveals its true shape. Not a community, not a family, not a promise, but a machine. A machine that will someday decide it no longer needs Camden. And when the machine finally walks away, it won't just take jobs, it will take identity, it will take generations, it will take the sound out of the air, because factories like this don't only build radios, they build lives. And when they die, they don't die alone. Cut to black. The gate clanks, the crowd holds. The factory behind them stays silent, just for a moment, like it's listening, too. They say, "You can't kill a giant. In Camden, New Jersey, we're going to watch one do it to itself." Chapter 1. The visionary before Camden was a cautionary tale, before the shattered windows, the emptied lots, the myth of a giant that vanished. This story begins in something smaller than the future ever admits. Not a headquarters, not a monument, a machine shop. Late 1890s, Camden, New Jersey, the kind of place where the air is permanently seasoned with oil mist, iron filings, and the faint bite of hot brass, where the light coming through the windows doesn't shine so much as it falls in tired, dusty columns onto workbenches scarred by 1,000 urgent fixes. A shop like this doesn't make speeches, it makes parts. It makes things fit, it makes things work, and inside it, a mechanical engineer named Eldridge Reeves Johnson is doing what builders always do, obsessing over the gap between what exists and what should exist. In 1896, inventor Emil Berliner, the man behind the gramophone and the flat disc record, came to Johnson with a problem that sounded small but wasn't. Berliner needed a spring-driven motor for his gramophone, something reliable enough to spin a record at steady speed without the whole experience collapsing into squeals and wobble. To most machine shop owners, that job would have been a contract, a paycheck, a nice little order. To Johnson, it was a doorway. He didn't just build the motor and move on. The sources describe him becoming fascinated. That word doesn't do it justice. This is the moment the gramophone stops being a novelty and becomes an engineering insult, a challenge, a device that almost works, which is the most dangerous kind of device to show a perfectionist, because early sound reproduction was full of lies. It promised you music and then delivered a ghost of music, thin, distorted, dying at the edges. It was the industrial age trying to bottle something human and messy and alive, and the bottle kept leaking. Johnson's mind latched onto the leak. He began pushing improvements, chasing stability in the turn, precision in the parts, consistency in manufacturing. Over the next few years, he developed improvements not just to the machines, but to the processes behind them, how the whole ecosystem of record-making and playback could be made more dependable. And here's where the early struggle begins. Because in America, at the turn of the century, the sound business already had kings. Thomas Edison and Columbia had spent years building distribution networks, public goodwill, and a dominant format, cylinders, before Johnson truly arrived as a rival. When Johnson incorporated the Victor Talking Machine Company in 1901, he wasn't the first. He was the man walking late into a knife fight with better tools and fewer friends. He had to win on something that couldn't be faked. He had to win on quality. In 1900, Johnson formed the Consolidated Talking Machine Company, and after a maze of patent fights and reorganizations, the business became the Victor Talking Machine Company in Camden in 1901. That word, Victor, carries the taste of battle. Even the histories acknowledge how tangled the origin is. Legal victories, personal pride, branding myth. But what matters for the human story is this. The name wasn't just a label. It was a posture, a declaration that the builder at the bench intended to beat the giants. And if you picture Johnson in those first years, don't picture him like a modern executive. Picture him like a man haunted. Because quality control in a world that's scaling from hand-built gadgets to mass production is a form of paranoia. It's the fear that if you let one sloppy part slip through, one motor that drags, one tone arm that rattles, one record pressed with inconsistency, you're not just losing a customer, you're losing the fragile belief that this technology deserves a place in the home. The early phonograph wasn't a utility, it was magic, and magic that fails once becomes a joke forever. So Johnson built Victor like a crusade, not merely to sell sound, but to prove sound could be trusted. Camden was the perfect staging ground, a working city, a river city, a place built to move materials, wood, metal, shellac, through docks and rail lines and into the hands of craftsmen who knew what it meant to earn a living with their fingers. The company's identity from the beginning was physical. Machines you could hold, fix, and improve. But the struggle wasn't just technical, it was cultural, because quality costs money, and young companies bleed money. Every improvement is a wager. Every rejected batch is a tiny self-inflicted wound. Every insistence on higher standards is an argument with the invisible accountant that every future empire eventually hires. In the beginning, Johnson was the standard. He didn't outsource the soul of the product. He was the soul, an engineer founder whose credibility came from making the machines behave. And that obsession, this builder's refusal to accept good enough, did something remarkable. It made Victor more than a factory. It made it a belief system. Victor wasn't just selling machines. It was selling an idea that an American company could mass-produce something precise, refined, and culturally powerful. Music and prestige packaged as furniture, as engineering, as domestic pride. By the time the company established its first research laboratory in Camden in 1907, it was already acting like an institution that intended to out-invent its future problems. And the city responded the way company towns always do at first. People came, skills accumulated, generations began to orbit the plant the way moons orbit a planet, pulled by wages, stability, and the quiet pride of working for something that the whole country recognized. In the warm glow of that early success, it's easy to forget the fragility of it all, because empires built on quality have a hidden weakness. They teach everyone to expect quality forever. They set a standard that cannot be cheaply maintained. They create a promise that becomes, over time, a contract. And when a company grows large enough, it eventually meets the temptation to break that contract, slowly, rationally, with paperwork. Not because it hates its workers, not because it wants to be evil, but because it starts to believe its name matters more than the hands that built it. In the early years, with Johnson close enough to smell the oil and hear the machines, that betrayal still feels impossible. But you can already see the shape of the tragedy forming, like a hairline fracture in a flawless record. Because the thing that made Victor powerful, the founder's insistence that the product be worthy, will one day be treated as an inconvenience by men who never stood at the bench. And Camden will be the place where that change becomes visible, where the giant's heart first learns what it feels like to be replaced. Chapter 2. The boomtown Camden doesn't wake up the way quiet towns wake up. It wakes up like a machine. At dawn, the city's streets fill with the soft thunder of footsteps and streetcars and lunch pails tapping against knees. Whole blocks lean toward one direction, pulled by the same invisible force, the factory complex down by the river. The closer you get, the more the air changes. It thickens, part coal smoke, part wet timber, part varnish and glue, like the city is breathing out its purpose. This is the era when Victor stops being a company and becomes a planet. In the early years, the factory buildings are practical, almost modest. Then suddenly, the growth becomes aggressive. New shops appear the way mushrooms do after rain. Carpentry, finishing, assembly, packing, each one a new organ added to an animal that refuses to stay small. Victor's success doesn't just add jobs, it rearranges the geography of Camden itself. By 1910, the operation has swollen into something locals describe as an industrial colossus spreading across downtown. And then comes the tower. Not a corporate tower, this isn't Manhattan. This is an industrial tower, a lighthouse built of brick and pride. Building 17, completed in 1916, rises above the complex and starts doing something strange for a factory building. It becomes a landmark, a signature on the skyline, the kind of architecture that says, we aren't merely producing goods. This city belongs to our output. At night, the most haunting detail isn't the height, it's the light. The tower's enormous leaded glass windows, depicting the company's famous image, were installed in 1915 and were meant to be illuminated, visible for miles. Imagine that, an industrial plant turning its brand into stained glass, like a cathedral commissioning saints. And the saint is a dog, a faithful animal listening for a master's voice from a machine. In a boom town, symbols matter. They become shortcuts for identity. A worker could point to that tower and feel something close to pride. That's my shift. That's my paycheck. That's my kids' shoes. That's my city. Inside the complex, the tempo becomes relentless. Victor's products aren't just built, they're crafted at scale. The paradox that defines American industrial glory. Victrolas aren't a single assembly line spitting out plastic shells. These are furniture-like objects, wooden cabinets made in dedicated carpentry shops, finished and polished until they can sit in the front room like an heirloom. And because these machines are designed to live in the home, everything about them has to feel civilized. Smooth hinges, clean joins, finishes that glow under lamplight. That obsession pulls skilled hands into the plant. Carpenters, machinists, finishers, packers, and it trains entire neighborhoods to think of work not just as labor, but as making something worthy. By 1917, Camden's Victor factories are producing Victrolas on a staggering scale. Numbers so large they sound like exaggeration until you remember what the boom era is. Demand piling on demand, orders stacked higher than common sense. This is the part of the story that modern America almost can't process. A company so dominant that it doesn't just sell to customers, it shapes the way the country experiences leisure. The Victrola becomes a piece of domestic ritual, families gathering, a needle set down, the room filling with music that feels like a miracle because it can happen anytime, not only when a band comes to town. And then the city wraps itself around the miracle. Camden's relationship with Victor becomes intimate, almost marital. The factory provides wages. In return, it receives loyalty that seeps into family histories. People don't just say, "I work at Victor." They say it the way you say, "I belong to something." The plant becomes an inheritance. A father gets in, then a son, then a cousin. A neighbor vouches for a neighbor. Recommendations are traded like currency. This is how the social contract forms, not in a single document, but in a million quiet agreements. Show up on time, do the work, don't embarrass the company. And the company, in return, becomes the stabilizer of a working life. Steady pay, a predictable rhythm, the comforting illusion that if you do everything right, the ground beneath you won't move. That's the euphoria of the boomtown. You start to believe the prosperity is normal. From the outside, the complex looks like a triumph of modern organization. Buildings aligned to purpose, rail and river access feeding the appetite, the skyline stamped with that tower. From the inside, it feels like motion without end. The hum of machinery, the smell of cut wood, the grit that lives permanently under fingernails, the sound of crates being nailed shut like coffins for products that will be reborn in living rooms across the country. And yet, if you stand back far enough, you can see the trap already setting. Because a boomtown doesn't just grow jobs, it grows dependence. It trains an entire city to tie its future to a single employer's mood, a single corporation's strategy, a single brand's relevance. Every new house built, every corner store opened, every kid enrolled in school, some of that money traces back, eventually, to the factory gates. The tower becomes more than architecture. It becomes a promise. As long as that building stands, there will be work. And promises like that are the raw material of tragedy, because the same scale that makes a company powerful also makes it arrogant. It starts to believe the demand is permanent, that the public will always want what it makes, that the city will always be there to supply labor, that the workers will always accept the terms, because what choice do they have? Even the name, Victor, begins to harden into a kind of fate. In these golden years, it's hard to imagine that the cathedral could ever empty. Hard to imagine those stained glass windows broken, vandalized, dark. Hard to imagine the tower no longer guiding anyone home from a shift. But boomtowns always carry a shadow, even at noon. Because when a factory becomes the heartbeat of a city, the city doesn't just share in its success. It shares in its vulnerability, and the bigger the heartbeat, the more catastrophic the silence will be when it finally stops. Chapter 3. The Arsenal. By the time the war arrives, the factory has already learned how to live without sleep. But wartime doesn't just extend a schedule, it rewires a place's soul. In Camden, the river wind cuts sharper in winter, and the factory complex takes on a new kind of light, less celebratory, more guarded. The gates feel tighter, the guards more serious, the windows less like windows and more like watchful eyes. The city that once built music for living rooms now begins building something for oceans and skies, something meant to detect, to guide, to destroy before the enemy can even be seen. In the beginning, it doesn't look heroic. It looks like paperwork. It looks like crates marked with codes instead of product names. It looks like men in suits who don't belong on the shop floor, walking fast, talking low, pointing at machines as if they're weapons, because now they are. The old world of Victor, the polished cabinets, the domestic magic, doesn't vanish overnight. but it gets pushed aside, like furniture in a house when someone moves a hospital bed into the living room. Because this is what happens when a consumer empire is drafted into the war machine. The factory stops being a symbol of comfort and becomes an arsenal. Camden's plants expand and pivot into the development and production of radar and related equipment, while other RCA facilities around New Jersey and beyond are geared towards specialized tube production and supporting electronics. The scope of the shift is enormous, an industrial organism rearranging its organs to meet a single urgent purpose. And if you could walk the halls then, if you could drift like a ghost through the corridors and down the stairwells, you'd feel the difference immediately. The sounds are harsher, less music, more metal. The scent changes too, less wood and varnish, more solvents and hot insulation, the sharp chemical bite of a world building things it hopes it won't have to use. On the shop floor, precision becomes obsession all over again. Only now the stakes are not customer satisfaction. The stakes are bodies, because radar isn't a cabinet you can refinish if it's scratched. Radar is a second chance at life for a crew in a blacked-out Atlantic night. Radar is the difference between a ship that returns and a ship that becomes a story people whisper about. That's the thing most people forget about America's industrial peak. It wasn't powered only by patriotism. It was powered by fear, made manageable through manufacturing. Fear turned into schedules. Fear turned into shifts. Fear turned into components with tolerances so tight you could measure them in fractions of a human hair. In Camden, workers feel it in their bones. They work longer, later, stranger hours. The factory's old rhythm, the predictable pulse of boomtown prosperity, transforms into something more frantic and less forgiving. You can't simply clock out of a war, not when the newspapers are full of sinking ships and telegrams and maps with arrows, not when you can sense the nation holding its breath. And so the plant becomes a world of its own. Humming city inside a city, where the sun is irrelevant, where time is measured in output, where the only season that matters is deadline. There's another transformation, quieter but just as profound. The people change. Wartime America pulls men into uniforms and factories pull in everyone else. Women take places on lines, at benches, in roles that used to be treated as men's work. Older workers come back. Younger workers lie about their age. People who never imagined themselves inside a plant find themselves learning the language of machines. Because the war doesn't ask permission. It takes what it needs. And somewhere in Camden, in row houses and cramped kitchens, families adjust their lives around the new factory reality. Meals at odd hours, children learning not to wake a parent sleeping in daylight, spouses living like ships passing in the same narrow hallway. The social contract evolves. In the boom years, loyalty was exchanged for stability. In war years, loyalty is exchanged for survival. National survival, yes, but also personal. The factory paycheck becomes the lifeline that keeps households afloat while the world burns. The plant doesn't just provide work, it provides the sensation that you're doing something that matters enough to justify the exhaustion. And yet, even here, in this era that would later be romanticized as the good old days, you can see the seeds of the horror to come. Because wartime production doesn't only accelerate output, it accelerates scale. It teaches a corporation that it can grow bigger than any single community, bigger than any single identity. It teaches management to think in terms of mobilization and logistics, to treat people as units of labor that can be arranged like inventory. And once a company learns to view its workforce that way, once it feels the power of reorganization at massive speed, it becomes easier later to reorganize for reasons that are less noble. In the moment, it's hard to notice. The war wraps everything in righteousness. But beneath the flags and slogans, a more permanent lesson is being written into corporate muscle memory. If you can convert a music empire into a radar machine, you can convert anything into whatever the balance sheet demands. That's the paradox of Camden's wartime glory. It's real glory, real contribution, real skill, real sacrifice. The plant becomes a crucible of American technical ambition aligned with a national cause. It helps prove that industrial America can do the impossible when the stakes are absolute. And when victory finally comes, it would be tempting to think the story returns to normal, that the plant simply goes back to building comfort and leisure, that the boomtown promise renews itself. But history doesn't work that way, because war changes the relationship between a company and its own size. It changes the kind of leaders it rewards. It changes what the public expects. It changes what the factory believes it is allowed to become. And after the war, when the future opens again, television, consumer electronics, a new age of American optimism, Camden will still be standing at the center of the machine. For a time. But the war taught the giant something dangerous, that it could reinvent itself at will, and a giant that believes it can reinvent itself without consequence eventually tries to reinvent itself without its people. Chapter 4. The poison doesn't announce itself with sirens. It arrives like a policy memo, like a reorg chart, like a new phrase whispered through the hallways: synergy, efficiency, modernization, words that sound clean enough to eat off of, even as they scrape the grease off the company's hands. For years, Victor's religion was simple: build it better than anyone else can. The founder's world was made of tolerances, craftsmanship, and a kind of pride you could feel in the weight of a finished machine. But then the company becomes something bigger than a workshop obsession. It becomes a symbol. And symbols attract the kind of people who don't want to build, they want to control. The first major shift is almost invisible at the time because it comes wrapped in triumph. In 1929, RCA acquires Victor. On paper, it looks like destiny, the radio titan swallowing the phonograph titan, the future absorbing the past, a marriage of electronics and entertainment. The headlines would have read like inevitability. The public sees a stronger giant, but inside a factory culture, stronger can mean something darker. It can mean further away. Because once you're part of a vast corporate organism, decisions stop being made by the people who smell the oil and hear the machinery. Decisions are made by people who see the factory as a line item, an asset to optimize, a cost center to discipline, a workforce to manage. And that's where the poison begins. Not in a single villain, not in a single moment, but in a gradual replacement of values. A builder asks, how do we make it last? A corporate empire asks, how do we make it pay? At first, the changes don't look like betrayal. They look like progress. RCA brings scale, capital, and a new era of ambition. Radio everywhere, electronics everywhere, a future of signal and screen. Camden is still important. It still hums. The machinery is still loud. The jobs are still there. So the workforce keeps walking through the gates because the contract still seems intact. But something about the air changes. The Victor identity, the intimate craft-driven pride, starts getting diluted in the larger chemical bath of RCA's corporate strategy. You can feel it in the way people talk. Less about the product itself, more about divisions and quotas and market share. The company begins to speak in abstractions, and abstractions are dangerous because they allow human beings to be treated like numbers without anyone feeling like a monster. And then comes the second needle. The post-war years are a golden age for American consumer electronics. Television blooming into living rooms, radio becoming a household necessity, the promise of modernity sold as appliances and entertainment. RCA rides that wave like a king, and kings get used to being obeyed. That obedience becomes a habit. Inside a giant, success doesn't just create confidence, it creates arrogance. It creates the belief that the brand is invincible, that the public will always buy what you make because you're the one who taught them to want it in the first place. In a culture like that, quality becomes negotiable. Not because anyone says, let's make garbage. No one ever says that. They say things that sound reasonable. Let's reduce costs. Let's streamline. Let's meet demand. Let's keep up with competitors. And slowly, the builder's question, is it worthy, gets replaced with the accountant's question, is it profitable enough? This is how a cathedral turns into a warehouse without anyone lighting it on fire. Camden begins to feel the distance. Not immediately, not as a collapse, but as a subtle draining of intimacy. Decisions about what happens inside these walls increasingly come from elsewhere. The plant becomes one piece of a sprawling empire rather than the center of a world. And when you are no longer the center, you can be sacrificed. Then the third needle, branding. A company's symbols tell you what it values. And RCA/Victor's most famous symbol, Nipper, the dog listening faithfully, wasn't just cute marketing. It was a statement. Sound as trust, technology as companionship, the machine as a voice in your home. So when corporate leadership effectively drops the Victor and Nipper branding in the late 1960s, it's more than a design refresh. It's a cultural confession. It says, we don't need the old mythology anymore. It says, we're not selling the same kind of relationship. It says, the past can be discarded if it's inconvenient. And if a company can discard its own history, its own public soul, how hard is it later to discard the people who lived that history on the factory floor? To the executives, it's rational, modern, clean. To the workers, it feels like watching a family name get erased off the mailbox. There's a particular kind of grief in that. Not the grief of losing a job, but the grief of realizing the institution you served is becoming something you don't recognize. And here's the most insidious part of the poison. It doesn't reduce the factory's output right away. It may even increase it. That's why everyone misses it. Because decline in industrial horror rarely begins with empty parking lots. It begins with the wrong victories, the kind of victories that reward shortcuts, the kind that teach a corporation it can take more and give less, the kind that convince leadership that the machine can run forever, even if the people inside it are burning out. If you're a worker in Camden during these decades, you don't see poison the way a historian does. You see it as small humiliations, a new policy that makes the line faster, a benefit that becomes harder to access, a supervisor who talks to you like you're replaceable. You feel it in your shoulders, in your back, in the way your spouse hears you come home quieter than you used to. You feel it in the city, too, in the slow shift from confidence to unease, in the way local businesses start listening harder for bad news, in the way people begin talking about what if with a seriousness they never used when the giant was young. Because a boomtown can forgive a lot, but it can't forgive the sensation that the heartbeat is starting to hesitate. And above it all, looming like a warning carved into brick, stands Building 17, the tower, the stained glass, the icon of loyalty. A dog listening for a voice, a worker listening for a promise, a city listening for the sound that tells it everything is still okay. The poison of hubris is that it convinces the giant it can change the rules without consequence, that it can be bigger than its own workers, bigger than its own city, bigger than the social contract that made it possible. And once that belief sets in, the rest of the story becomes a countdown, not to an accident, not to a single scandal, but to an abandonment that will feel, when it finally arrives, like a betrayal so complete it rewrites the meaning of loyalty itself. Chapter 5. The Warning Signs. The first warning sign is never a crater in the ground. It's a sentence spoken too casually in a break room, a sentence that lands wrong and then sits there, quietly poisoning the air. Did you hear they're moving a line? Did you hear they're cutting overtime? Did you hear they're testing something new? Somewhere else? In a company town, rumors move faster than trucks. They slide under doors, they ride home in lunch pails, they show up at the dinner table, between mashed potatoes and silence. And the scary part is that the rumors don't always sound catastrophic at first. They sound reasonable. That's how the rot disguises itself, because when a giant begins to wobble, it doesn't want anyone to call it wobbling. It calls it adjusting. It calls it modernizing. It calls it staying competitive. And the workers, people with mortgages, kids, aging parents, want to believe it. They need to believe it. A city can survive bad news, but it can't survive uncertainty without losing its mind. So at first, the warning signs are small. A department that used to take pride in craftsmanship is told to speed up. A supervisor who once cared about precision now cares about numbers on a clipboard. A veteran worker watches a new batch of parts come through and feels that sick, intimate dread. These aren't as good. Not broken, not unusable, just not as good. And in a company that built its empire on the promise of quality, not as good, is a prophecy. Outside the walls, the world is changing faster than Camden streets can keep up with. New competitors arrive with different cost structures, different manufacturing philosophies, different national strategies. Electronics becomes a global battlefield, and the old American assumption, we lead by default, starts to crack. But here's the thing about titans. They interpret warning signs as insults. They look at competition and don't see a threat. They see audacity. How dare anyone think they can do what we do? How dare anyone believe the giant can bleed? This is where hubris becomes an operational policy. Instead of reinventing with humility, the giant doubles down on identity. It leans on reputation. It leans on the inertia of being the name. It leans on marketing and distribution and the slow-moving habits of consumers who grew up trusting the brand. And inside the factory, workers feel that gap between reality and leadership widening like a crack in glass. The men at the top talk like the future is guaranteed. The people at the bottom can see the seams, because they're the ones touching the parts. They're the ones hearing the machines complain. They're the ones watching waste increase and shortcuts become routine. And they're the ones who know a brutal truth that executives often forget. A product can survive a little corner cutting. A culture cannot. A factory culture is built on pride, on the belief that your labor matters, that your hands produce something worthy of your life's hours. When that pride is undermined, when the work becomes just output, you don't just lose quality. You lose the invisible glue that keeps a workforce loyal when things get hard. Then come the labor tensions, because of course they do. In a place like Camden, labor isn't an abstract political concept. It's a home. It's families. It's the right to breathe without begging. RCA's Camden operation had already seen bitter battles earlier in its history. Workers knew what it meant to fight for dignity inside a corporate empire. The memory of those fights never fully disappears. It just waits. So when management begins tightening screws, faster lines, stricter policies, wage pressures, workers don't experience it as efficiency. They experience it as betrayal. And betrayal has a sound. It's the tone of a foreman who stops talking like you're a person. It's the way schedules change with no notice. It's the way injuries are treated like inconveniences. It's the way the company that once felt like a lifelong partner starts acting like a landlord. Cold, distant, transactional. In the city, the warning signs spread outward. Corner stores notice fewer lunches being bought. Bars notice people nursing a single beer longer than they used to. Churches notice the prayers shifting from gratitude to pleading. And in living rooms across Camden, a new phrase creeps into conversations: backup plan. That phrase is a dagger, because the boomtown was never supposed to need a backup plan. The factory was the plan. And then the layoffs begin, not necessarily as a sudden mass purge, but as attrition, contraction, departments thinning out. A man who's worked the same line for 20 years comes home early because his shift was canceled. A woman who's built her life around steady hours now has to take whatever schedule she's given, because refusing feels like volunteering to be next. Every cut is explained as temporary, every cut is rationalized, and every cut trains the city to accept less. This is how giants kill places, not with one dramatic act, but with a long series of small decisions that add up to a death sentence. Meanwhile, the skyline still stands. Building 17 still looms. The stained glass windows, those old icons of loyalty, still exist as a kind of cruel joke. The image of faith remains, even as the institution that demanded faith begins withdrawing from the people who gave it. The psychological damage is subtle but devastating. A worker who once felt pride now feels dread. A worker who once believed in permanence now feels foolish for believing at all. And the worst part is that the company can still look healthy from the outside. It can still advertise. It can still sponsor. It can still project confidence. Because corporate collapse often begins while the brand is still smiling. That's why the warning signs matter. Not as trivia, not as background noise, but as the moment the relationship breaks. Because once the workforce stops believing the company will honor the contract, the whole industrial mythology begins to unravel. And when the mythology dies, the machine doesn't stop immediately. It keeps running. It keeps extracting. It keeps insisting everything is fine, right up until the day it isn't. And Camden, which built its time around the factory gates, will soon learn the difference between a giant that stumbles and a giant that decides it can walk away without looking back. Chapter 6. The Collapse. Collapse is rarely a single day. It's a long retreat that management tries to disguise as a strategy. In Camden, the retreat starts the way corporate endings always start. Not with sirens, not with headlines, but with emptier mornings. A parking lot that used to fill like a ritual now has gaps that stay gaps. A shift change that once sounded like a stadium emptying becomes quieter, thinner, like the factory is losing blood but trying to keep its face straight. For the workers, the collapse doesn't feel like a business story. It feels like the ground moving. It feels like waking up one morning and realizing the job you built your life around has become a negotiation you never agreed to participate in. And the worst part is the psychological cruelty of it. The factory is still there. The buildings still stand. The tower still watches. So your brain keeps insisting it can't be over. A thing this big doesn't just disappear, but giants don't disappear in smoke. They disappear in paperwork. In the 1980s, RCA, the empire that once sold the American future through radios and televisions, gets swallowed into a larger corporate universe when General Electric completes its acquisition of RCA in 1986. And on the outside, it's easy to tell yourself this is just the natural cycle of American capitalism. One titan absorbing another, efficiency replacing nostalgia. Inside a plant like Camden, it lands differently. It lands like an eviction notice taped to the inside of your skull, because acquisitions don't just buy assets. They buy permission. Permission to reclassify people, to reorganize cities, to treat communities like inventory. The language is always clean, portfolio, consolidation, divestiture. But the reality is simple. When the new owners look at the map, Camden isn't a hometown. It's a cost. So the factory enters its final phase, the slow conversion from living organism to husk. Departments shrink, functions migrate. The work that once justified the plant's enormous footprint begins to thin out, like the factory is exhaling its purpose one last time. People who used to talk about retirement start talking about timelines. People who used to plan 5 years out start planning 5 weeks out. And then the place begins to empty in a way that feels almost supernatural. One of the most symbolic blows is the moment the Nipper building, Building 17, the cathedral on the skyline, stops being used by GE, vacates it in 1992, and the change is immediate. When a building like that is occupied, it's loud even when it's quiet, because it's full of motion, routine, electricity, purpose. When it's abandoned, the silence becomes a physical substance. The building doesn't just lose people, it loses heat, it loses maintenance, it loses the small, everyday acts that keep a structure alive, replacing a pane, tightening a latch, painting over rot before rot becomes collapse. Without those acts, a factory begins returning to the elements, and the elements are patient. After vacancy, the deterioration becomes fast and brutal. The structure is vandalized, stripped, violated, because abandoned industrial spaces are magnets for a certain kind of hunger. The hunger for copper, for scrap, for anything that can be sold. And there's a special cruelty in watching that happen to a place built on pride. It's like watching a body get picked clean while the city is forced to pretend it isn't happening. But the collapse isn't only symbolic, it's logistical. It's the last operators shutting off systems. It's entire rooms going dark. It's the factory losing its status as the heart and becoming the leftover. By 1993, the Camden plant's activity ends. Successor operations vacate and abandon the site. That's the moment the giant stops even pretending it still belongs to the city. Not because Camden failed it, not because the workers stopped caring, but because the corporate machine decided the math no longer justified the flesh. And if you want to understand why that feels like horror to the people left behind, imagine the last days from the inside. A supervisor walks the floor with a clipboard, but there's nothing left to supervise, only the choreography of shutdown. Machines that once ran like heartbeat now run like ritual, finishing out obligations, clearing inventory, preparing to be sold, moved, scrapped. People pack up tools they've used for decades and label them like they're shipping pieces of themselves to strangers. Some workers try to treat it like a normal day because the alternative, admitting grief in public, is unbearable. They tell jokes that don't land. They avoid eye contact with the people who look like they might cry. They focus on the small tasks because staring at the big picture feels like staring into a void. And outside, the city feels it. In a place built around factory rhythms, closure isn't just unemployment. It's disorientation. The school schedule, the grocery habits, the neighborhood economy, everything was calibrated to that pulse. When the pulse weakens, every supporting system starts trembling. This is the moment the boomtown promise reveals its trap. A company can be the heartbeat of a city for 100 years and still walk away like it never lived there at all. The tower remains for a time as an insult, a reminder, a monument to loyalty that outlived the institution that demanded it. The image of a dog listening faithfully becomes less cute with each passing month because the people who built this empire realized something too late. They were listening for a voice that was never obligated to answer. And that's the final shape of the collapse. Not just the loss of jobs or buildings, but the collapse of belief. The belief that the giant would protect its own. The belief that permanence existed. The belief that a city could tie its fate to a factory and not be punished for it. Camden learned the hard way that giants don't need to hate you to destroy you. They only need to stop needing you. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. The Ruins. Come with me now, not into history, but into what history leaves behind. It's daytime, but the light doesn't feel friendly here. It falls flat against blank walls and open lots, as if the sun itself is confused by what it's looking at. Where there used to be an industrial continent, buildings packed tight, rail spurs, loading docks, the constant choreography of labor, there are gaps. Wide, empty gaps that don't feel like space. They feel like missing teeth. You walk the perimeter and your mind keeps trying to fill the emptiness with sound. It almost succeeds. You can almost hear the old machine hum in the back of your skull, like phantom pain. But when you stop and listen for real, what you get instead is wind, distant traffic, a gull, the faintest creak of something loose, somewhere moving because it has no other purpose. This is what happens when a factory dies. The world doesn't celebrate. The world simply continues. And the dead thing is left to weather. At the center of the memory, still looming like a stubborn thought, is the old tower, the Nipper Building, Building 17. For decades, it was a landmark, a corporate cathedral on the skyline. It's the kind of structure that looks like it was built to outlast the people who built it. And in a way, it did. But survival is not the same as life. After the building was vacated, it suffered the indignity that every abandoned industrial site suffers. Invasion, vandalism, theft, broken windows that turn rain into a slow, patient demolition crew. And if you've ever stepped inside a place like that, an industrial corpse, you know the first sensation isn't fear, it's grief. Because abandonment is intimate, it's personal. It's the feeling of walking into a room and realizing everyone left in a hurry, and no one came back to say goodbye. The floors carry layers of dust that weren't there when the building had purpose. Doorways become frames for emptiness. Old shafts and corridors stretch into darkness like veins that no longer carry blood. On certain days, sunlight slips through shattered panes and turns the floating dust into glittering static, as if the building is trying one last time to broadcast something. But there's no signal, only noise. That's the urban exploration version of this story, the version captured in countless quiet photographs and trembling handheld videos. Boots crunching on glass, flashlights probing corners, the wide-angle view of a place built for thousands, now hosting only the occasional trespasser and the mice. Yet the true haunting here isn't the broken glass. It's the scale. When you stand inside a structure like this, you can feel how many lives it once held at once. How many conversations, how many arguments, how many jokes, how many silent moments of concentration as hands moved the same way they'd moved for decades. And now those hands are gone. A factory ruin forces you to confront something we're not trained to understand anymore. The fact that civilization used to be built not just by ideas, but by places. Places where thousands of people spent their best hours, day after day, building the physical objects that made modern life possible. When those places rot, we don't just lose architecture, we lose a kind of shared meaning. Camden's waterfront is full of that lost meaning. Even where buildings have been demolished, the ground still feels like it remembers. If you know what to look for, you can see the scars, old foundation lines, oddly shaped lots, the way streets bend around ghosts of structures that aren't there anymore. Sometimes redevelopment tries to seal the wound by turning the relic into something new. The Nipper Building itself was eventually rehabilitated and converted, reborn as the Victor, a mix of lofts and modern space. And in one sense, that's a win. It's better than total erasure, better than watching the tower collapse into rubble and become nothing more than a footnote. But there's another sense, an uncomfortable sense, in which adaptive reuse can feel like a form of forgetting with nicer lighting, because a loft apartment can't hold the same kind of memory that a factory floor held. A cafe can't reproduce the sound of shift change. New drywall can't absorb the stories that old brick did. When you polish an industrial ruin into a lifestyle product, you preserve the shape of the building, but often strip away the truth of what it meant. And what it meant was people. People whose identities were intertwined with this place so deeply that when it died, part of them died with it. You can't see that on a brochure. You can't measure that on a property listing, but you can feel it if you talk to the families. The ones who still remember a grandparent coming home with the smell of the plant clinging to their clothes. The ones who remember the factory as a constant in the background of childhood, like weather, like gravity. They'll tell you how the closure wasn't just financial pain, it was a spiritual injury, because the factory wasn't merely an employer, it was a narrative. Work hard, be loyal, build something real, and your life will make sense. When the plant left, it didn't just remove income, it removed certainty. And without certainty, communities don't just get poorer, they get tired, they get fragile, they get prone to despair. That's the hidden aftermath of industrial collapse, the long tail of consequences that don't show up in dramatic footage. Kids growing up watching their parents lose stability, people leaving because there's no reason to stay, neighborhoods hollowing out the way the factory did, only slower. So when you stand in the shadow of what's left, whether it's a repurposed building or an empty lot, you're standing at the edge of two realities. One is the glossy narrative, renewal, redevelopment, progress. The other is the quieter narrative that lives in the negative space, the story of the people who were never redeveloped, the ones who were told, implicitly, that their labor was necessary until it wasn't. The ones who kept their side of the bargain and watched the other side walk away. In the wind off the river, it's easy to imagine the ghosts people talk about in places like this. Not literal ghosts, though the human mind loves that poetry, but the ghosts of routine, the echo of a bell, the imagined clatter of carts, the sense that if you turn a corner, you should see a line of workers in coats, faces half asleep, moving toward a clock-in station. But you won't. Instead, you see the modern world trying to build over the scar, and you realize the most haunting thing of all. A factory can die and the skyline can still look fine. Buildings can be repurposed. Lots can be cleared. The city can keep existing. But the lost civilization, the one that lived inside those walls, in those shifts, in those paychecks and arguments and pride, that civilization doesn't come back. Not really. It becomes a story. It becomes an absence. It becomes the feeling you get when you stand in a quiet place that used to be loud, and you realize the silence is heavier than any machine that ever ran there. Conclusion: the eulogy for a giant. They don't teach you how to mourn a factory. We know how to mourn people. We have rituals for that. We have funerals and prayers and flowers and final words that try to stitch meaning over loss. But when an industrial civilization dies, when a place that fed an entire city simply empties out, there's no universally accepted ceremony, no day of mourning on the calendar, no moment when the nation stops and admits what it just allowed to happen. The giant just leaves, and everyone still has to wake up the next morning and pretend the silence isn't crushing. Because here's what the RCA Victor factory in Camden really was. Beneath the branding and the skyline and the stained glass myth, it was a promise that a person could trade their labor for stability, a promise that skill and loyalty would be rewarded with dignity, a promise that a city could build itself around a single engine, and that engine would keep running, because that's what engines do, until they don't. For decades, the promise felt real. You could touch it. You could hear it in the shift-change roar. You could smell it in the river air mixed with wood dust and hot metal. You could see it in the rhythm of Camden streets, the way entire neighborhoods moved like clockwork toward the gates and away again, day after day, year after year. And if you were a worker, you didn't think of it as industrial policy. You thought of it as life. A paycheck meant groceries. Groceries meant dinner. Dinner meant kids who grew up believing the world had rules they could rely on. That's the true product the factory produced. Not radios, not records, not electronics. Continuity. A sense that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough for you to plan a future. So what did we lose when the giant collapsed? We lost more than jobs. We lost the idea that a place can be sacred without being a church. We lost a kind of civic heartbeat, a shared rhythm that made strangers into neighbors because they were all part of the same shift schedule, the same economic gravity. We lost the dignity that comes from making something real and knowing the nation depends on it. And perhaps worst of all, we lost the truth of the bargain. Because the moral injury of Camden isn't just that a company left, it's how it left. Not with a full stop that allowed grief to be processed, but with a drawn-out vanishing act, work thinning, buildings emptying, departments migrating, the city's dependency exposed like bone. It taught a brutal lesson, that loyalty is not a contract if one side reserves the right to change the meaning of loyalty whenever it becomes inconvenient. And this is where hubris becomes the true villain. Not a single executive, not a single merger, not a single economic wave. Hubris is the disease that tells a giant it can outgrow responsibility, that it can separate itself from the people who made it, that it can treat a city like a tool, use it, wear it down, and discard it when the math changes. The builder-founder culture, those early days of obsessive precision and pride, was rooted in something simple, the belief that making a great product required respect for the process and the people doing it. But as the company grew, the center of gravity shifted. The blueprint was replaced by the spreadsheet. The obsession with craft was replaced by the obsession with extraction. And once that transition became complete, the end was no longer a question of if. It was only a question of how quietly can we do it. Camden answered that question the hard way. Quietly enough that the rest of the country could pretend it wasn't happening. That's the tragedy of industrial collapse in America. It rarely arrives as a national emergency. It arrives as local catastrophe, city by city, town by town. Each one treated as an isolated misfortune instead of part of a larger pattern. And when you visit what's left today, whether you're staring at emptier lots or standing beneath a rehabilitated tower, you can feel the strange contradiction of modern America. We preserve the architecture sometimes. We almost never preserve the promise. You can renovate brick. You can polish windows. You can install new lighting and call it revival. But you cannot restore the lost belief that work will be rewarded with security, because that belief isn't housed in walls. It's housed in trust. And trust is the first thing hubris burns. So the RCA Victor Factory becomes a parable carved into Camden's waterfront, a story about American genius, American scale, and American self-destruction, a story about how the same force that builds giants, ambition, can, when corrupted, become the force that kills them. Because the giant didn't die because the workers stopped caring. The giant died because it stopped caring about the workers. And in the end, that's the final image you're left with. Not the roar of the assembly line, not the bright optimism of a product launch, but a silent building, a vacant stretch of land, and a city still listening for a voice that has already moved on. They say you can't kill a giant, but in Camden, New Jersey, we watched one do it to itself. And we learned what it costs when the heartbeat of a city becomes disposable. Final line. The saddest part isn't that the factory fell silent. It's that for a long time, America did too.